Chapter 11 Sea Change, Race in Europe and America. Jamal's father is a manager for a company with branches all over the country. Every 2 years or so, the family moves from one nice neighborhood in a suburb near a big city to another. Jamal knows he has to watch it. Each school has its own style, its own slang. If he comes in the first day of high school flashing the most popular brands from his last school, he could be announcing to the whole school that he is an outsider, a loser. He knows that each school has their codes that cannot be questioned, but that end at the edge of its district, new school, new code. If you look at race in the 19th century, that is exactly what you see. The rules in Europe and in America were firm, yet changed completely every time you crossed the ocean. White equals not Irish. In 1833, the very same year that Andrew Jackson told Congress that the Cherokee would have to lose their land, Britain became the first nation in human history in which a government of slaveholders permanently abolished slavery. In Haiti, a successful revolt puts former slaves in charge of the country, and during one short phase of the French Revolution, slavery had been abolished in France. Had the Americans lost the Revolutionary War, a whole generation of blacks might have been born free. And yet, a dozen years after liberating Africans who lived thousands of miles away from England, those very same legislators chose not to act well. One out of every 8 of the Irish, their closest neighbors, died. In fact, they spent 2.5 times as much, £20 million, compensating West Indian planters for the loss of their slaves as the £8 million they devoted to the dying in Ireland. How could that be? How could the British be so humane and so callous at the same time? This question about England and Ireland actually leads back to the question, white equals free, that had been in American law since 1790. The British were pushed to take the extremely bold step of outlawing slavery as a result of a brilliant public relations campaign waged by longtime opponents of slavery such as the Quakers. In advertisements, posters, lectures, the British public was repeatedly shown the instruments of torture used to control enslaved Africans, as well as the horrible conditions on slave ships. Josiah Wedgwood, whose China is still popular today, created a seal showing an African in chains with the motto, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Women wore the seal as a cameo, a forecast of modern political buttons. When mailing a letter, people would press Wedgwood's seal into the wax that closed their envelopes. Wedgwood's seal really was the ancestor of all of the pop-up and banner ads that fill computer screens today, for each letter arrived with a blazing message of abolition. As the British public came face to face with images of slavery, depriving a man, a group, a race of freedom came to seem barbaric, unchristian. The campaign to abolish slavery was Christian crusade at its very best. It was a kind of holy war, but a war of words. Just as Luther and the Protestants were aided by the printing press, the anti-slavery message was easier to spread because there were now many newspapers and magazines, and it was easy to print up flyers and handbills. Paid lectures spread across England to carry the message. One even brought a slave whip with him as a prop. Massive petition drives gave women, the poor, and other people who had no vote a way to be seen and heard. The abolitionists managed to make the suffering of slaves real to English people who never actually meet a slave. Starvation in Ireland was a different matter. The English felt they knew the Irish only too well. As Henry Cromwell had said in the 1650s, the Irish needed to become more English, even if it took being sold in slavery to accomplish that. The Irish had been exposed to English Protestantism, English values, English government for centuries. Many English felt that if Irish remained poor, ill-read, and Catholic, if they could not feed themselves, that was their problem. The Irish did not need help. Instead, they needed to improve themselves. Their suffering was their own fault, and trying to help them would only make it worse. The Irish were morally weak, undisciplined, given to drink, incapable of the kind of self-improvement that made England great. The image of the Irish was very similar to what Andrew Jackson had said about the Indians. The Indians were not white, were the Irish. In England, that was the wrong question. Being Irish and Catholic were bad enough. In America, it was the only question. Irish equals not black. The great majority of the Irish people depended on potatoes for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Potatoes were cheap, filling, and easy to grow. But in 1845, a mysterious blight killed off much of their crop, and it hit again the next year. The Irish starved, watched their children waste away, fell victim to disease and despair. Then the desperate Irish began to flee from their ravaged homeland. Approximately 1.8 million people, nearly a quarter of their population, boarded boats so frail and ill-equipped they were called coffin ships. When they arrived in America, the Irish were both welcomed as cheap labor and resented as people. The influx of penniless Irish pleased people running businesses since the new workers would accept low wages. But the majority of Americans were of English Protestant background and shared England's anti-Catholic and anti-Irish views. Many Americans saw the Irish as savage, brutish, ape-like. To these Protestants, the Irish seemed to be clannish, given to drinking and fighting, all too attentive to their Catholic priests and corrupt political bosses. Apparently, they were incapable of the kind of independent thinking that was supposed to be the hallmark of free and white America. Could crossing the ocean turn an Irish brute into a responsible white American? Ironically, horribly, the answer to this question came to rest in the Irish attitude towards slavery. In the first half of the 19th century, by far the most powerful and beloved Catholic leader in Ireland was Daniel O'Connell. He led the struggle to bring rights to the Catholics and to free Ireland from English domination. Yet, when a group of supporting slavery offered to aid his cause, few joined them. O'Connell was outraged. "Gentlemen," he thundered, "God knows I speak for the saddest people the sun sees, but may my right hand forget its cunning and my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. If to save Ireland, even Ireland, I forget the Negro one single hour." Over and over, O'Connell sent messages condemning slavery to America. "Irishmen and Irishwomen, treat the colored people as your equals, as brethren, but your memories of Ireland continue to love liberty, hate slavery, clean by the abolitionists." The American Irish did not listen to even the greatest leader of Ireland. The Irish were eager to prove that they belonged in America, and that they were just like the dominant white Protestants. An Irish group in Pennsylvania entirely rejected O'Connell's stirring cry. They were citizens of America and had no particular view of slavery just because they came from Ireland. Being like other white Americans was now much more important than listening to a leader from the old country. In the time of Columbus, the Spanish were all the more determined to eliminate all traces of Judaism precisely because of their own mixed ancestry. Something similar was true for the Irish. Blacks in America were sometimes called smoked Irish, and the Irish were said to be blacks turned inside out. In poor city neighborhoods, the Irish lived near blacks, and there was a growing population of mixed children. The Irish were often seen as nearly black, and in fact, the two groups were often in competition for the same low-paying jobs. That made it all important to the Irish to draw a clear line to separate themselves from the blacks. As the Irish shrank away from the blacks, they became important to one of the dominant political parties of the day. The Democrats were aligned with the slave-holding South and against the Northeastern Protestant elite. Democrats wanted to make it easier for poor people to vote, as long as they were white. In the 1820s and 1830s, for example, New York and Pennsylvania dropped many of the rules that had limited the vote to men who owned property. At the very same time, these states added new rules that either made it more difficult for blacks to vote or forbade it altogether. These northern free states were taking away the black vote even as they were making room for poor whites, such as the immigrant Irish. The Irish were welcome to become voting Americans so long as they were not black. This alliance was sealed by the very nature of the abolitionist movement. Many of the abolitionists were precisely the kind of elite Protestants who disliked the Irish as people even as they exploited them in their businesses. To the American Irish, the cause of freeing the slaves in the South looked like distraction, maybe even a plot. Owners they suspected aimed to squeeze them by freeing blacks who would work for even less. Much as some Americans working in minimum wage jobs today blamed their low pay on competition from illegal immigrants. To the Irish, the real issues were getting better wages in the North and proving that they belonged, that they should be accepted as real Americans. This attitude on the part of the Irish only infuriated the abolitionists and confirmed their worst fears about the new immigrants. To the abolitionists, for example, nothing was worse than returning a free man to captivity. Yet, in 1854, when the escaped slave Anthony Burns was captured in Boston, a militia company manned by Irishmen marched him back to a lifetime in bondage. Principled legislators such as Charles Sumner, who devoted themselves to freeing black slaves, now worked to restrict the voting rights of the Irish. The charged relationship among elites, Irish and blacks, exploded into violence during the Civil War. On July 11, 1863, law took effect that allowed the Union to draft men to serve in its armies, but it had a loophole. Anyone called to serve could buy his way out for what would be today $4,000 or pay substitute to take his place. Elite, rich abolitionists could stay home mouthing fine principles while poor Irish were sent off to die for a cause they did not support. Irish resentment of the draft were up to 2 days later. A crowd poured through the streets of New York shouting, "Down with the rich men." The rioters attacked government offices, the homes of the wealthy, and any black people they could find, even children in orphanages. Day after day, the violence spread, and the assaults grew more frequent and vicious, until black people were diving off piers and swimming out to boats just to escape the bloodthirsty mob. In the 4 days of the draft riots, approximately 150 black people were killed. Another 300 or so Irish, who were eventually brought under control at gunpoint. German Americans in particular took the lead in fighting off the Irish. A prominent New York newspaper, though, excused the rioters. The American people, the world did not want their government in the hands of the white race alone. Even as the Irish encountered one form of prejudice at home, embraced another in America, the whole matter of race and racism was playing out in yet another way in Germany. German equals not Jewish. Germany in the 18th century was a reverse image of America. The American states were bound together by a constitution all had ratified. One president, one senate, one House of Representatives served all. The city of Washington was created to be the capital of what was officially the United States. By contrast, there is no such thing as Germany. As of the 1820s, there were 36 district entities, each with its own ruler and its own laws. This splintering was the result of centuries of war. As Catholics and Protestants had battled and carved out their own territories, and as localities as small as cities managed to gain self-government? What could possibly unite people living under so many different rulers, and sets of laws? This was one of the great questions for 19th century Germans. Imagine what Americans would have felt had the revolution ended inconclusively, with some colonies remaining under British control, some independent states, New York City governing itself as a city-state, and because there were no large nation, no Washington, D.C. at all, we too might have been endlessly vexed over the question, what is an American? Enlightenment thinkers tried to apply reason to Germany's patchwork of laws, many of which were particularly discriminatory against Jews. In 1812, Frederick William III of Prussia finally agreed that Jews could be considered full citizens of his lands. But 7 years after that, anti-Jewish riots spread from city to city, and even the most educated Jews were forbidden to teach in college, practice law, or rise in the military. Jews were showed exceptional promise, were given a stark choice: convert or know for certain you will never have a career. Throughout the next 100 years, the German lands repeated a similar seesaw pattern, a liberal phase in which laws against Jews were eased, followed by an explosion of anti-Jewish violence or change in government that would bring new restrictions. Anytime a ruler opened schools, jobs, or government positions to Jews, they eagerly rushed to take advantage of the opportunities. Jewish authors, professors, composers soon took the place as some of the most famous and most highly regarded German thinkers and artists of their time. They were under intense pressure to convert, and many went along with the demand, but a growing group of Jewish, or recently Jewish, people was becoming a recognizable part of German society. Liberal, wealthy, highly educated Germans were pleased at the rise of the Jews. In turn, some of the most visible German Jews used their prominence to advocate for the broader cause of freedom and liberation. Just as in Ireland, where Daniel O'Connell spoke eloquently against slavery and for the rights of Africans, the poet Heinrich Heine wrote that the great task of our time is emancipation, not just of the Irish, the Greeks, who were at the time were oppressed by the Ottoman Turks, the Frankfurt Jews, the West Indian blacks, and other oppressed people. It is the emancipation of the entire world. In this alliance, in the most open-minded segments of German society and the most outspoken Jews, there was the beginning, the glimmer of a kind of United States of Germany, built on the principle of shared human rights. Still, the promise of Germany united around the concepts of equality and democracy did nothing to challenge widely held prejudices against Jews. Descendants of people who had gone to churches that showed images of a horned Moses, who had slaughtered Jews in crusades, who had forced Jews to step aside as they passed, who had heard Luther preach against the Jewish greed, were ready to believe the worst. Rulers reluctant to give up power found ready allies in peasants who hated Jews and resented their new prominence. Together, kings and peasants crushed their emancipators, but by mid-century the prospect of Germany united around liberal principles was dead. Still divided up into their 36 states, Germans began to believe that what united could be found in culture. German language was one part of that. Another was history and tradition. The brothers Grimm, for example, went in search of the myths, legends, and fables that made Germans German. Very much like the modern Americans who search for their roots in family histories and tales passed down, in food and customs, Germans fanned out to record their traditions. If you think of culture in terms of anything that can actually be thought, seen, or heard, the Jews not only triumphantly contributed to Germany, they were among the most important creators of its best achievements. By the very fact that Jews were so able to write, compose, and teach in German led to a new objection. German culture was not any one specific creation. Instead, it was something that could be defined, a kind of essence that only pure Germans had or ever could have. President Jackson could not acknowledge that the Cherokee were behaving like whites. Similarly, no matter what a Jew did, he would never be German. What was this absolute difference between Jews and Germans? Some found the answer in an idea that had been proposed in 1791. The Jews are a very singular race. German-speaking Jews could never really be German because they were of a different race. Even as the Germans searched for their deep connections, peoples throughout Europe were feeling the need to separate themselves out from others and to form their own countries. The French, the Italians, the English, the Germans, not to mention Poles, Czechs, Slavs, Hungarians, Croats, Serbs, all felt the yearning to have their own nations, populated only by those who shared a common history, a common language, a common religion. But in each case, the Jews were marked, once again, as outsiders. Ironically enough, the modern state of Israel was a product of a very similar yearning, creating a homeland for Jews. English equals not Hindu. In 1813, Francis Hardin Hastings, the Earl of Moira, and the new commander-in-chief of English forces in India, landed in Calcutta. Lord Moira, having served with distinction fighting against the Americans in battles from Bunker Hill to Charleston, was thought to be the perfect man to take control of England's affairs in India. As a young man, George Washington held the arrogant contempt English soldiers held toward Americans. In India, the English gave full rein to their attitudes of racial superiority. Lord Moira had no doubt that the people he was sent to govern were of different and decidedly inferior race. The Hindu, he observed, appears a being nearly limited to mere animal functions, with no higher intellect than a dog, an elephant, or a monkey. This brand of racism was so common among the English that it was reflected in the words they used and heard every day. Indians were always to refer to the English as Sahib. In its original Hindi, the word just meant companion, but as applied to the English, it meant lord or master. As one Englishman put it in 1847, the term was an involuntary confession of the master race energy of his people, and if Indians were to call the English Sahib, the English knew what word to use for the Indians, nigger. The word that in America stands for the worst racial attitudes towards Americans was used by the British to show the same contempt for Indians. This was a declaration of white European superiority, but it also shows that racial rankings depended on local conditions. The bottom run in Germany was reserved for the Jews, in Ireland for the Irish, in India for the Indians, and America for Africans. Just as in Ireland, Germany, and the American slave states, racist attitudes in India were expressed in laws and social codes. As late in 1919, for example, the Indian Gentleman's Guide to Etiquette instructed any Indian with self-respect never to enter a train car in which Europeans were seated. Identify yourself, the book insisted, with the race to which you belong. If an Indian riding on an animal saw an Englishman on the road, he was to get off and walk. If an Indian was even carried an open umbrella to shade him from the heat or protect him from the rain, he was to close it in the presence of any Englishman. Hindus had their own rigid code for ranking fellow Indians, the caste system. In the original Sanskrit, the word for caste is varna, or color. Scholars debate how closely this ancient Indian ranking system matches the Western racial biases discussed in this book, but certainly Hindus had their own prejudices, which were strictly enforced. A boy born to a merchant family must become a merchant. A girl would marry a person perfectly matched to her social station. The very bottom of the social system was reserved for people considered so marginal they were related without caste, or untouchables. Outcasts were expected to handle unclean tasks, such as sweeping sidewalks or throwing out refuse. That was their unchangeable fate. Just as in America, where European conquerors replaced equally tyrannical Aztec and Inca rules, the English brought their own ideas of racial superiority to a land in which people were ranked from birth. In Europe, the English left the Irish to die. In America, slaveholders embraced them as allies, offering the benefits of being considered white, while abolitionists saw the Irish as allies of evil who could not be trusted as full citizens. In Germany, the effort to unite separate lands through tolerance and enlightened laws failed. Instead, the very rise of the Jews led others to define Jews as a separate race that could never be German enough. Yet during the draft riots, German Americans battled against the Irish to defend blacks. In India, ruling over people whose lives were governed by their own system of caste only made the English more certain that they were the master race. Throughout the world, as people from different nations were fighting, immigrating, and interacting, those who were dominant were determined to mark themselves off from those beneath them. The new idea of race seemed to offer the clearest, most absolute, and scientific way to establish those rankings. And yet, the codes varied from country to country, continent to continent. Blumenbach's scheme of 5 color-coded races simply cannot make sense of these cross-currents and subdivisions. Yet these inconsistencies did not cause people to reject the idea of race, just the opposite. With the next crop of racial theories, race changed from a temporary grouping of individuals to the eternal fate of peoples. The various branches of the human family are distinguished by permanent and ineradicable differences, both mentally and physically. They are unequal in intellectual capacity, in personal beauty, and in physical strength. Count Joseph Arthur Gobineau. The man responsible for this last and most devastating aspect of race theory was a French author who was extremely well read. He studied everything he could find about the peoples of the world and came to a riveting, grim conclusion. In 1855, Count Gobineau's The Inequality of the Human Races announced that race was the key to all human history. Aristotle was wrong. Climate was not important. Augustine was wrong. History is not a lesson in sin and redemption. The Enlightenment is wrong. History was not the struggle of reason against superstition. History was much closer to biology. Each race was born, grew, flowered, and then, when mixed with other races, degraded and collapsed. Governments, laws, noble ideas were irrelevant. Race and only race explained everything. That also meant that race mixing was a kind of suicide. To Gobineau, white was not precise enough to capture the history of the races. Instead, he called on the ideas of an Englishman who had lived in India. William Jones was a gifted linguist as he studied the languages and civilizations of India. He began to notice words in its ancient language of Sanskrit that were similar to Latin, Greek, German, and even Persian. This was marvelous detective work. Scholars now believe that all of those languages are part of the Indo-European family, and thousands of years ago had a common ancestor. Race theorists took this a step further. They argued that the people who spoke the ancient language, the Aryans, were the original dominant race, the creators of all civilization. It might seem that discovering that they were related to Indians would pose a problem to the English Sahibs. Not at all. Northern European Protestants saw themselves as not only Aryan, but Anglo-Saxon, the heirs of the freedom-loving Germanic tribes. In their own minds, the Anglo-Saxons were the best of the best, the pure Aryan strain. Gobineau believed that Aryans had been the only hope for humanity, but he was certain that they, the true whites, were doomed. The white species, he warned, will disappear henceforth from the face of the earth. Before Aryans mixed with any other races, they were as gods. When they had limited contacts, they produced the era of heroes. His Aryan blood thinned, the nobility ruled, but now humanity was on an inevitable slide to failure. The future was bleak. It will be the last stage of mediocrity in all aspects. Mediocrity in physical strength, mediocrity in beauty, mediocrity in intellectual aptitudes, one might also almost say annihilation. Gobineau saw the proof of his grim prediction in America. Americans were a terrible Mongol mix, in which the superior Anglo-Saxon breed was muddied by blending with the inferior Irish, and now with blacks and Indians, the most degraded beings on the planet. The American edition of Gobineau's book was published in 1856, even as American courts were hearing the case of a slave who believed he should be free. Dred Scott was a slave, but had lived in free states and territories. He was asking the court to grant him his freedom. The following year, the Supreme Court ruled against Scott because black slaves had no rights, which the white man was bound to respect. Blacks, Chief Justice Roger Taney believed, were condemned by their race to be property. Ideas similar to Gobineau's were now enshrined in American law. Gobineau's account of the Aryans as the near gods now irreversibly dying off was both convincing and terrifying. Race was no longer just a description of human variation. It was the key that would decide the fate of the human species. In ways more terrible and unexpected than Gobineau could have ever imagined, he was right.